3,500 years ago, in the middle of the Mediterranean, something happened that still feels slightly unreal. On the island of Crete, a society emerged that looks suspiciously modern for the Bronze Age. Not modern like smartphones, obviously, but modern in the way it was organized, connected, and confident. They built sprawling palace complexes with multiple stories, light wells, careful airflow, paved courts, and plumbing systems that included drains, baths, and yes, toilets that actually flushed. Their walls weren't just stone and mud brick. They were covered in color, dolphins, lilies, processions, acrobats flying over bulls, images that don't scream a world obsessed with war, but something stranger, something almost optimistic. We call them the Minoans, and in a lot of ways, they're the first European civilization that feels like a superpower, even though they didn't rule by marching legions across continents. They ruled by ships, by trade, by ideas moving faster than armies. And here's the thing, they didn't only build cities and palaces, they built a mystery. They left behind a writing system we still can't read, Linear A. So we can see their records, we can touch their clay tablets, but we can't fully hear their voices. And then there's the myth layer, the one that just refuses to die. A monster in the Labyrinth, a bull-headed nightmare, a king named Minos, a hero from Athens. Is that story a distorted memory of something real, or is it later Greek imagination stapled onto older ruins? And then, right when they seem to be at their height, they weaken, they fracture, and the world they dominated starts to slip away. Was it a volcanic catastrophe from Thera, the island we now call Santorini? Was it earthquakes, famine, political instability, some slow unraveling that doesn't look dramatic until it's too late? Or did outsiders, Mycenaean Greeks, move in and take what was left? And yeah, we're going to talk about Atlantis too, carefully, like adults, because even if Plato was writing philosophy, he still might have been borrowing the emotional memory of a real disaster. So today, we're going back to the Bronze Age to rediscover the lost world of the Minoans, and to ask a question that always matters in any era. What does it look like when a golden age turns suddenly into ash? Now, quick human moment before we jump in. If you're using this video to fall asleep, honestly, that's kind of perfect. That's exactly why I make these. But if you want more long-form history like this, maybe subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always read them, and it's genuinely wild seeing London at breakfast and San Francisco at bedtime, all at once. Different lives, same mysteries. So, when people say the ancient world, most of us jump straight to a familiar highlight reel. Athens, Sparta, the Parthenon, maybe Alexander, maybe Rome if we're drifting west. And that's not wrong, it's just incomplete. Because for a long time, even historians carried around this mental image of early Greece as a kind of slow warm-up, a prelude with not much going on, and then boom, the classical age arrives like the main event. But the Minoans don't fit that story. They're like a shape in the fog. You see them, you can't unsee them, and suddenly the whole timeline feels haunted in the best way. And I want to start with that feeling because it matters. The ghost isn't just a poetic idea, it's a real problem in how we imagine the past and how the past was literally recovered. In 1900, Arthur Evans, British archaeologist, journalist, a man with money and opinions, starts digging at Knossos on Crete, and what he finds is not a little village, not a few scattered potsherds that politely confirm what you already believed. He finds a massive complex. Corridors, staircases, storerooms, courtyards, painted walls, signs of administration, signs of wealth. And then, layer by layer, it becomes obvious that this isn't early Greek in the way people expected. It's older, and it's different. And honestly, it's kind of embarrassing for the old narrative, because it suggests that the Aegean world had already done the civilization thing at a high level long before the famous city-states were even a thought. So that's the first ghost, the ghost of our own assumptions. We like clean origin stories. We like the idea that Europe woke up in classical Greece, but on Crete, the lights were on a long time earlier. Now, there's another reason I'm calling it a ghost, and this one is more literal. The Minoans don't greet us the way Egypt does, with names carved into stone and kings shouting their achievements in hieroglyphs. They don't greet us the way Mesopotamia does, with a mountain of readable tablets telling you about taxes and beer and lawsuits. With the Minoans, we have plenty of evidence, tons of it, but the evidence feels partial. You walk into their world through architecture, through art, through trade goods, through bones and seeds and broken cups. You don't walk into it through a clear historical narrative written in their own language, because we can't read that language. So they're present and absent at the same time. You can map where they lived. You can date their pottery styles. You can track their contacts across the sea. But you can't sit with a Minoan text that says, here is who we are, here is what we fear, here is what we believe. That's a ghostly kind of presence. It's like standing outside a house at night, seeing the lights through the curtains, hearing movement, but you can't make out the words. And that's why the Minoans hit people differently. They're not just ancient, they're ancient and quiet. Now, one more layer to this, the way the Minoans get filtered through Greek memory. Because when later Greeks talk about Crete, they don't talk about it like a normal neighbor. They talk about it like a myth factory. King Minos, the Labyrinth, the Minotaur, Theseus, Ariadne. And what's wild is that when Evans starts excavating, those myths are already in the cultural bloodstream. So you're not digging in a neutral landscape. You're digging in a place that already comes with a story attached, like a label stuck on a jar before you even open it. And Evans, this is where it gets complicated. He wasn't just uncovering, he was also interpreting, reconstructing, sometimes boldly, sometimes controversially. He named the civilization Minoan, after Minos, even though we don't know what they called themselves. He reconstructed parts of the palace at Knossos in ways that helped people visualize it, but also shaped how the world would imagine it. So the ghost is also the archaeologist's shadow. It's the fact that what we see is partly ancient reality and partly modern reconstruction, modern storytelling, modern desire. And that doesn't mean it's fake. It means we need to be honest about the lens. So what were the Minoans in the simplest terms? They were a Bronze Age civilization centered on Crete, flourishing roughly in the 2nd millennium BCE. They built large palace centers like Knossos, Phaistos, Mallia, and Zakros. They developed complex craft industries, long-distance trade networks, and an administrative system that used writing. They produced art that still looks startlingly alive. And they did all of this in a world where power usually screams through fortifications and weapons and monuments to kings. The Minoans, at least in the way they present themselves in their art, feel different. Their imagery leans toward nature, movement, ceremony, and sometimes, this is important, female figures in prominent roles. That's going to matter later. But already in Chapter 1, I want you to feel the contrast. They are not the Greeks you expect, and they're not the Near Eastern empires you might compare them to. They're their own thing. Now, I can hear the skeptical voice, and it's a healthy voice, saying, okay, but are we romanticizing them? Are we projecting some peaceful paradise onto them because the art is pretty? Great question, and we're going to keep that skepticism active the whole time. Because the truth is, Crete wasn't a utopia. No human society is. They had hierarchy, they had labor systems, they had power concentrated in palace centers, they had inequality. They also lived in an earthquake zone, in a region of constant competition, where piracy existed, where violence existed. The difference is that the evidence for violence looks different, and the story we've inherited about them is tangled with myth, and that makes them easy to romanticize. So the goal isn't to turn them into saints, the goal is to understand what kind of civilization they actually were, and why they feel so strangely out of place in the usual European story. And here's the last piece of the ghost before we move on. The Minoans sit at a crossroads, geographically and historically. Crete is positioned like a stepping stone between worlds, mainland Greece to the north, Egypt to the south, the Levant to the east, and the open sea to the west. If you want to move goods, people, ideas, styles, technologies across the eastern Mediterranean, Crete is not a bad place to be. So when we talk about the Minoans, we're not just talking about an isolated island culture. We're talking about a network culture, a connector, a place where influences meet and get remixed into something new. And that's why when we finally see them through archaeology, it feels like discovering a missing chapter in a book you thought you knew. It's not a footnote, it's a whole storyline. So that's the setup. The Minoans are the ghost in the Mediterranean because they appear early, they appear vividly, and yet they don't speak to us in a clear, readable voice. They are known through fragments, beautiful fragments, frustrating fragments, and through stories told by others long after they were gone. We're going to walk into the place where that ghost becomes architecture, the palace, the so-called Labyrinth, the beating administrative and ceremonial heart of Minoan Crete. Picture this, not as one single building, like a royal mansion with a front door and a throne room. Think of it more like an organism. Rooms, corridors, open courts, staircases, storage, workshops, a complex that grew over time, got repaired, expanded, and sometimes rebuilt after earthquakes. That's the mindset you need for a Minoan palace, because the word palace is a trap. It makes you imagine a king behind a gate, guards on the walls, a neat little hierarchy with a crown on top. And what you actually get at places like Knossos is messier and honestly more interesting. These palace centers look like they handled administration, storage, craft production, ceremony, elite residence, religious activity, maybe all at once. And right away you run into the famous detail people love to repeat because it is genuinely unusual for the Bronze Age. The major palaces don't have the kind of massive defensive walls you'd expect if you grew up on castles and sieges. Now, does that prove they were peaceful and nobody ever fought? No, that's the romantic trap. But it does suggest their security wasn't primarily built around thick fortification walls wrapping the main complex. It points to other layers of power: control of the sea, control of resources, social organization, maybe alliances, maybe simply different threat models than the mainland. Also, there's a practical reality. Crete is an island. If you're strong at sea, the sea becomes part of your defense system. So the absence of huge walls is not proof of utopia. It's a clue that their world worked differently. Now let's walk into Knossos, because this is the site that basically set the tone for the modern image of the Minoans. And the second you enter the plan, even on paper, you feel the next big feature: complexity. corridors that turn, rooms opening into other rooms, staircases stacking levels, routes that don't feel straightforward, a large central court that acts like the anchor. This is where the labyrinth idea starts to feel emotionally believable, even if it's not literally true. If you dropped a stranger into this place at its height, with multiple stories and shifting routes and busy spaces, yeah, they might feel lost, not in a magical way, in a very human way, like, I do not know where I am and I just walked into a building that runs an entire society. But here's the fact-check part. There's no clear evidence the palace was designed as a maze on purpose, like a puzzle dungeon, and there's no sign of one clean master blueprint the way you'd imagine a modern architect's plan. A simpler explanation is usually better. The complexity probably comes from growth over time and institutional needs. Storage rooms get added. Workshops cluster where they make sense. Access routes evolve. Repairs happen after damage. Expansions happen during prosperous periods. So, Labyrinth is likely a later storytelling lens laid on top of a real complex that was, yes, extremely intricate. And this is where we have to mention Arthur Evans again, because the image in your head of Knossos is often a mix of ancient reality and modern reconstruction. Evans rebuilt portions of the site using modern materials. He made choices about color. He made choices about how columns should look. Some choices were grounded in evidence. Some were interpretation. And those choices became wildly influential, almost too influential, because they shaped popular culture's default picture of Minoan. That doesn't mean we throw everything out. It just means we keep a small mental warning label. Some of what looks crisp and finished today is partly the 20th century speaking. Now, multi-story construction. This is real, and it's one of the most impressive architectural features. You have clear evidence for upper levels and stair systems. You also have light wells. These vertical open spaces brought daylight and airflow into the interior, and when people casually say air conditioning, what they usually mean, if they're being responsible, is passive cooling. Thick walls, shaded corridors, air movement through courts and light wells, orientation and design that make large spaces livable. No, there weren't AC units humming in the wall, but yes, they understood comfort and they built for it. Then there's plumbing, which always makes a modern audience lean forward because it collapses distance. Minoan sites show advanced water management, drains, channels, systems that move water in and wastewater out, and in elite contexts, installations that function like flushing toilets using water flow. We should say it carefully, this wasn't a modern city with standardized bathrooms for everyone, but it was sophisticated engineering in the contexts where power and resources were concentrated. And that matters because it tells you the palace wasn't just symbolic, it was infrastructure, it was management, it was control of basic systems like water. Long, narrow magazines lined with huge pithoi, storage jars, sometimes set in rows, like an inventory waiting to be counted. You don't build storage at that scale unless you're collecting, measuring, and redistributing surplus. Oil, grain, wine, textiles. The specific mix can vary, but the logic is the same. The palace is a node. It pulls goods in, it sends goods out. And the palace seems connected to craft production too. Workshops nearby, skilled labor clustered around the center, pottery, metalwork, seal carving, textile production. So the palace is not just a fancy residence, it's a machine, it's an ecosystem. Administration, storage, craft, ceremony, maybe elite living, all compressed together. Now the art. Minoan frescoes are famous for a reason. They're energetic and detailed. They show movement in a way that feels surprisingly fresh. Dolphins, lilies, marine life, processions, figures in motion. And here's what we have to say at the same time. First, these paintings show skilled specialists and serious investment. Second, the themes are telling. Many empires fill palace walls with conquest scenes and kings towering over enemies. The most iconic Minoan images lean toward nature, ceremony, athletics, and social display. Does that prove they were peaceful? Not necessarily, but it suggests the image of authority they wanted to project wasn't primarily "I crush you." It was more like "I organize, I host, I have abundance, I have order." And that pairs nicely with the lack of fortification walls. Both might be symptoms of a power system that didn't need to constantly advertise itself through military intimidation. Now we get to bowls, because bowls are the bridge between palace reality and myth. Bowl leaping imagery shows up in palace contexts, and it's hard to ignore. Bowls mattered in Minoan symbolism and ritual life. Some scenes strongly suggest acrobatics involving bowls. What we can't say with certainty is exactly how it was performed, how widespread it was, and whether every image is literal rather than idealized ritual art. But either way, the palace is the kind of setting where ceremony and spectacle could happen, especially around the central court. And once you imagine that court filled with people, movement, music, shouting, incense, and routine administration happening right nearby, the palace stops being a quiet ruin. It becomes a living environment, busy, loud, organized. And that takes us back to Labyrinth one last time. The fun version is Knossos equals Labyrinth, therefore the myth is basically a news report. The useful version is later Greeks may have preserved a distorted memory of Crete as a powerful center with an intimidating, confusing, bull-linked complex. That doesn't require a literal monster or a building designed as a maze. It just respects how cultural memory works. Real places and real power dynamics get turned into narrative. And there's also politics in the myth. Theseus and Minos is not just horror, it's a story about dominance, tribute, control, and who gets to call whom monstrous. So here's the takeaway. The Minoan palace is less about isolating a ruler behind walls and more about organizing a society around a central institution. Power expressed through logistics, through movement, through storage, through ceremony, through managed space. Next, we leave the palace corridors and go out onto the wine-dark water, where the Minoans start to look less like an island culture and more like the central node of a Mediterranean network. Let's zoom out for a second. Just look at a map. Crete sits right in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean, and once you see that, a lot of the Minoan story starts making sense without any fancy theories. Greece is up there to the north, Egypt is down to the south, the Levant is over to the east, Cyprus is in the mix too. So if you're living on Crete and you're good at ships, the sea isn't the edge of your world, it's the thing that connects you to everything. And that's why people keep describing the Minoans with this one idea, a thalassocracy, basically rule of the sea. Now, just so we don't overstate it, this isn't an official title the Minoans stamped on documents. It's a model we use, a way of saying this society's power seems to come from maritime dominance, trade routes, and influence, more than from marching huge armies across land. So what does that look like in real life, in actual evidence? It looks like reach. It looks like your pottery and your styles showing up far from home. It looks like foreign materials showing up in your own storerooms. It looks like contact points, repeated contact points, not a one-time lucky exchange. And it looks like, say, the Aegean Islands and coastal ports being part of a shared world where Crete is not a backwater, it's a center. Now, dominated trade can sound vague, so let's make it concrete. When archaeologists find Minoan-style pottery or Minoan-inspired wall painting techniques outside Crete, that's a clue. When they find objects on Crete that clearly came from elsewhere, that's another clue. And the pattern matters. One imported object could be an accident. A repeated pattern across sites and decades looks like a system. And the system is basically this. Ships move goods. Goods create relationships. Relationships create leverage. And leverage can become power, even if you never formally annex anyone. This is the part where we have to unlearn the idea that an empire has to look like Rome. In the Bronze Age Mediterranean, influence can be softer and still very real. It can be about who controls access, who can provide protection on routes, who can guarantee exchange, who sets tastes and standards, who has the prestige goods everyone wants. So you end up with a kind of empire made of connections. Now, people often ask, okay, where are the warships then? Where are the big naval battles? And the honest answer is, we don't have a clean Hollywood record of Minoan fleets the way we do for later periods. But that doesn't mean they weren't powerful at sea. Maritime power can show up in quieter ways. The ability to move safely, the ability to discourage piracy, the ability to maintain routes season after season, the ability to build and repair ships at scale, the ability to turn ports into dependable nodes. In a world where sailing is dangerous and expensive, reliability itself is power. And the Mediterranean at this time is not a nice blue postcard. It's risky. Weather can shift fast. Navigation is harder. Ships often hug coastlines. So, a society that becomes confident on the water is a society that has invested in knowledge and infrastructure. Sailors, shipbuilders, ports, storage, a calendar of routes, a sense of what can be moved and when. Now, let's talk about the neighbors in a grounded way, starting with Egypt. Egypt is the loud one, the one with the big monuments and lots of written records. And we have evidence for contact between the Aegean and Egypt, including Cretan goods and Cretan-style imagery appearing in Egyptian contexts and Egyptian objects ending up on Crete. It's not always easy to translate that into a simple modern sentence like, they were allies or they had a treaty. The ancient world doesn't give us neat paperwork for everything. But the material record makes contact hard to deny. And contact is never just economics, it's also status. If you're an elite on Crete and you can acquire Egyptian prestige goods, you're signaling that your reach is real. And if you're in Egypt and you have exotic Aegean goods, you're signaling the same thing in reverse. It's like saying, without words, my network goes far. Now, the Levant, that coastline of ports and city-states, is basically a trade engine for the whole region, connecting Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Crete is not far from that world by sea. So again, it's not surprising that we see links, materials, styles, seals, techniques. And it's rarely one-directional. It's a web. Crete doesn't just receive, Crete also exports. And when you're exporting consistently, you're shaping other people's tastes. That matters. Because taste becomes demand. Demand becomes dependency. Dependency becomes influence. Now, pull this back into everyday life for a second, because trade network can sound like something that happens only between elites. But a stable network changes the whole society. Think about what the palaces were storing: oil, wine, grain, wool, textiles, maybe specialty products like perfumes and dyes. Trade is not only exotic objects, it's also bulk goods and basic supplies moving through a system. And when those flows are reliable, people can specialize. You can support full-time artisans, full-time administrators, full-time sailors, artists who paint frescoes, builders who know how to raise multi-story structures. That's the real magic of trade. It doesn't just bring things in, it allows complexity to exist. Now, there's a point here that sets up the collapse story later, and I want to plant it now. A society built on networks can be strong, but it can also be vulnerable in a specific way. If your strength is routes, then disruption hits you fast. Storms, tsunamis, port destruction, a shift in politics in a partner region, piracy, even a few bad harvest years that reduce surplus. All of that can ripple through the system. You don't have to conquer a thalassocracy to hurt it. Sometimes you just break the connections and the structure weakens from the inside. So keep that thought. It's going to come back when we talk about Thera. Now, one more thing before we move on. It's tempting to reduce the Minoans to merchants and sailors, like they're basically Bronze Age traders with good branding. But they were building an identity too. Their art travels, their symbols travel, their administrative habits travel, their way of organizing space and ceremony travels. And when you see Minoan influence outside Crete, you're not seeing more than commerce. You're seeing cultural gravity. You're seeing that other communities either admired this style, depended on it, or wanted to participate in it. And that's what empire can look like without legions. Not a math with borders, a sphere of influence held together by ships, goods, and prestige. So that's our C chapter, Crete as a hub, connections stretching out toward Greece, Egypt, and the Levant, power that doesn't always announce itself with conquest, but still shapes the region. And now the question becomes, what holds that world together on the inside? What gives it meaning? What makes authority feel legitimate? That's where religion and ritual come in. Bulls, snakes, sanctuaries, and some of the most intriguing hints we have about status and gender in the Minoan world. Okay, so here's where things get tricky in a good way. Because with the Minoans, religion is not some separate Sunday activity off in a corner. It seems woven into everything, into art, into architecture, into public spaces, into how power presents itself. And the problem is, we're walking into a room where the labels are missing. We don't have a Minoan Bible. We don't have a clear set of myths written down in their own words. What we have are images, objects, shrines, bones, offerings, and later Greek stories that may or may not remember anything accurately. So the goal in this chapter is not to pretend we can fully reconstruct Minoan theology. The goal is simpler. What symbols mattered? What rituals are suggested by the evidence? And what that tells us about how their society worked. Let's start with the symbol everybody knows, because it's everywhere, the bull. Bulls show up in art, bulls show up in ritual imagery, bulls show up indirectly in the myths that later Greeks tell about Crete. And the first thing to say is the most basic. Bulls are powerful animals. They are dangerous. They are valuable. In a farming society, cattle are wealth in motion. So it's not mysterious that bulls become symbols of strength and fertility and status. What is more distinctive in the Minoan case is how central the bull seems to be in ceremonial life. You see bull imagery in frescoes. You see it in small figurines. You see it in relief. You also get that famous object that people call horns of consecration. These stylized horn shapes that appear in Minoan contexts. Now, are we 100% sure what every single symbol means? No, but the pattern is loud. Bulls mattered. Now, the famous question, bull leaping. Was it real? Or is it metaphor? Or is it one of those things where it started as a real practice and then became an idealized ritual image? The truth is, we can't prove it the way we could prove, say, a modern sport with rule books and stadium schedules. But the images are consistent enough to take seriously. They show humans interacting with bulls in a way that looks like acrobatics, grabbing the horns, flipping over the animal, landing behind it. And you don't have to be a professional athlete to see that this is extremely risky, which is part of why it feels ritualized. Because in many cultures, high-risk public acts become sacred acts. Not always, but often. They become proofs of courage, proofs of favor, proofs of status. So the safe, responsible way to say it is this. Bull leaping likely reflects some kind of practiced performance that had ceremonial meaning. It might have been a display for elites. It might have been tied to rites of passage. It might have been seasonal. It might have been rare. We don't know the details, but it's hard to reduce it to pure metaphor when the imagery shows technical consistency. At the same time, we should not talk like we're watching a televised event. The images could also be idealized. They could compress a ritual into one dramatic moment. So yes, we treat it as real adjacent, but we don't oversell certainty. Now, snakes. Snakes show up in a very different way. If bulls are public power and risk and spectacle, snakes feel domestic, intimate, even protective. The famous snake goddess figurines with a woman holding snakes are some of the most iconic Minoan images. And again, we have to be careful with names. Goddess is our label. We don't know exactly who she is. She could be a deity, she could be a priestess, she could be a symbolic figure representing fertility, household protection, the underworld, renewal, something like that. But the snakes matter because snakes are loaded symbols in many cultures. They shed their skin, they disappear and reappear. They live close to the ground, in cracks and holes, near houses and storage. They can be deadly, but they can also be seen as guardians. So when you see snakes in a ritual context, it often signals ideas about renewal and protection and the boundary between life and death. In Minoan Crete, the snake imagery seems to connect to female figures in a way that suggests female religious authority was not an exception, it might have been central. And that leads us into the thing that modern audiences always notice, and honestly, it's one of the most fascinating parts of Minoan art. Women appear a lot, and not only as background, they appear as prominent figures. They are richly dressed, they are centered in ceremonies, they look authoritative. And again, we don't want to turn this into a simple modern slogan like Minoans were feminist. That's not how history works, but we can say this. Compared to many other ancient societies in the region, Minoan imagery gives women unusually high visibility and status, at least in elite and ritual contexts. That could mean women held significant religious roles. It could mean priestesses were powerful. It could mean lineage and inheritance worked differently than we assume. It could also mean that public ceremony was one of the spaces where women's power was expressed, even if other parts of society were still hierarchical. We should treat it as a strong clue, not a final verdict, but it's a clue worth taking seriously. Now, where did ritual happen? Not only in one big temple, because Minoan religion doesn't look like one centralized priesthood in one giant building. Instead, it seems spread across different kinds of sacred spaces. You have what archaeologists call peak sanctuaries, sacred sites up on mountains where people left offerings. You have cave sanctuaries too, places that feel naturally symbolic, dark, deep, connected to the earth. You also have household shrines and small ritual spaces inside palace complexes. So religion is everywhere. High places, deep places, domestic places, institutional places. That distribution tells you something. It suggests a religious landscape that's woven into daily life and geography, not just a single official cathedral system. And it also suggests that different communities might have had local practices that still shared a common symbolic language. Bulls, horns, double axes in some contexts, snakes, female figures, processions, a shared vocabulary. Now, let's deal with the elephant in the room, or, I guess, the bull in the room, the Minotaur. Because if you say Crete, people want the monster, they want the Labyrinth, they want Theseus. And we're going to separate two things: the archaeological evidence of bull symbolism and ritual, and the later Greek myth about a bull-headed monster that eats teenagers in an underground maze. Those are not the same thing. The myth is not a documentary. The myth is a story told by Greeks in Greek political and cultural contexts long after the height of Minoan civilization. So why does it attach to Crete so hard? A couple of reasons are plausible. One, Crete really was powerful earlier, and later Greeks remembered it as a place of strange authority. Two, the palace complexes really were large and confusing and impressive, and labyrinth is a natural metaphor outsiders could use. Three, bull symbolism was real, and that gives the myth a hook. And four, myths often encode power relationships. In the Theseus story, Athens is the hero. Crete is the oppressive force demanding tribute. The monster is the horror at the center. That structure makes sense as a political myth about breaking free from an older power, whether or not it preserves any direct memory of actual events. So I like to think of the Minotaur as a kind of cultural echo. Not proof of a literal creature, obviously, but a signal that Crete occupied a particular place in the Greek imagination, a place of wealth, danger, sophistication, and otherness. Now, what does all of this tell us about Minoan social structure? It suggests that ritual and authority were intertwined, that elites used ceremony and symbolism to legitimize power, that large gatherings and processions mattered, that there were specialists who managed sacred spaces and offerings, and that women likely played visible roles in these systems, at least in the public religious imagery that survives. It also suggests something else that's easy to miss. Minoan religion might have been less about a single king claiming divine right and more about institutions and communities participating in shared rites. In other words, not the king is a god, but the society is held together by ritual practice. Again, we can't fully prove it, but it fits what we see. The emphasis on processions, the shared iconography, the multiple sacred spaces, the palace as a ceremonial center, not just an executive office. So here's the takeaway for Chapter 4. Bulls and snakes aren't random decorations. They're windows into how the Minoans made meaning. Bull leaping, whether we treat it as sport or ritual, shows a society that valued spectacle and risk and controlled danger in public settings. Snake imagery suggests renewal and protection and a sacredness tied to the household and the earth. And the visibility of women in ritual art hints at a social world that doesn't fit the later, more familiar Greek model in a simple way. And now, after all this symbolism, we hit the frustrating part. Because the moment you want to ask, so what did they actually call their gods? What did they say during ceremonies? What did they write down about all this? You run into silence. Not because they had no writing, they did, but because the writing they left us is still locked. And that's where we go next. Linear A, the Unbroken Code. All right. So imagine you're an archaeologist, or honestly just a curious person walking through a museum, and you're looking at a little clay tablet. It's not huge, it's not dramatic, it's not a golden mask. It's just this modest piece of baked clay with lines scratched into it. And the weird thing is, you can recognize it as writing right away. It has that look, repeated signs, patterns, a system. Somebody is recording something. Somebody is counting, labeling, organizing, maybe making notes that were never meant to last more than a season. And yet, for us, it lasts thousands of years, and we're stuck staring at it like it's behind glass because we still can't read it. That's Linear A. And if the Minoans feel ghostly in the earlier chapters, this is one of the main reasons why. We can see their paperwork, we just can't understand the words. Now, first, let's get a basic timeline clear, because people mix this up all the time. There are two linear scripts we talk about on Crete and in the Aegean. Linear A is associated with the Minoans. Linear B shows up later and is connected to the Mycenaean Greeks. Linear B was deciphered in the 20th century, and it turned out to represent an early form of Greek. Linear A is still undeciphered, and that difference is huge, because it means we can read a lot about Mycenaean administration, lists of goods, personnel, allocations, religious offerings, while the earlier Minoan administrative world remains largely silent, not because they didn't write, because we can't crack the code. Now, what do we actually know about Linear A without pretending we know more than we do? We know it's a writing system used primarily for administrative purposes, recorded on clay tablets and also on other objects like ceilings. We know it has signs that look related to Linear B, which is part of why people hoped it would be solvable. But similarity isn't identity. Some signs overlap. Some likely represent sounds. Some may represent whole words or ideas. And the bigger problem is not only the signs, it's the underlying language. If Linear A is writing a language that is not Greek and not clearly related to any well-known later language, then even if you can guess phonetic values, you still don't know what the words mean. It's like being able to sound out a sentence in a language you've never heard before. You can pronounce it, you still don't understand it. Now, why haven't we deciphered it? There are a few reasons, and none of them are because scholars are lazy, I promise. One reason is the amount and type of text. Most Linear A inscriptions are short, administrative, lists, labels. That means you don't have long narratives that repeat names and grammar in a way that helps you crack structure. You also don't have, as far as we know, the magical decipherment tool people dream about, a true bilingual inscription, like a Bronze Age Rosetta Stone, where the same text appears in a known language and in Linear A. That kind of artifact can change everything. Without it, you're working with pattern analysis, sign frequency, context clues, and educated guesses. Another reason is context. These tablets were often unfired originally. They were basically temporary documents. The reason we have them at all is usually because something burned. Fire bakes clay. Catastrophe preserves paperwork, which is a very dark fact about archaeology, by the way. So, we get these accidental archives from destruction layers, but they're not designed to be easy to interpret. They're designed to run a palace economy. Now, what kinds of things were they recording? We can't translate sentences, but we can still infer some functions. You see repeated signs that likely indicate commodities, measures, people, maybe places. You see numerical marks. You see patterns that look like accounting, and that fits perfectly with what we already saw in the palace storerooms. Those big storage jars aren't just there because people like collecting jars. They imply administration. Linear A is basically the paper trail of the palace system. It's the language of management, which is why it's so painful that we can't read it, because if we could, we'd suddenly have names, titles, transactions, religious offerings written in their own terms, maybe political structures spelled out. maybe hints about law or social categories. We might finally answer basic questions like, did they have kings in the way later Greeks imagine? What were the palace officials called? How were communities organized? What did they call Crete? What did they call themselves? Right now, those are questions we can only approach indirectly, and that's why Linear A isn't just a nerdy puzzle, it shapes the entire story we can tell. Now, let's talk about why Linear B was deciphered and Linear A wasn't, because that comparison helps. Linear B was tackled by many people, but the big breakthrough is associated with Michael Ventris, working with patterns, frequencies, and the assumption that the language might be Greek. And when that assumption turned out to be correct, the whole system snapped into focus. The signs could be assigned phonetic values. The words started to look like Greek, and suddenly tablets became readable. With Linear A, you don't have that same payoff. You can propose phonetic values based on overlap with Linear B, people do, but the resulting words don't resolve into a known language. So you can get stuck in this frustrating middle space. You can do the mechanics and still not reach meaning. And then there's the uncomfortable possibility that Linear A isn't one simple thing. It might have regional variations. It might have changed over time. It might include logograms, syllabic signs, abbreviations, bureaucratic shorthand, all the stuff that makes administrative writing efficient for insiders and awful for outsiders. This is one of the rare moments in ancient history where we have physical evidence of literacy and administration, but not access to the content. It's like finding a library where the books are sealed. You can weigh them, you can count them, you can sort them by size, but you can't open them. And it does something to our imagination. It forces us to fill gaps with Greek myth, with modern interpretations, with the parts we can see, like frescoes and palaces. That's why the Minoans become a screen for projections. Peaceful paradise, matriarchal utopia, secret rituals, Atlantis, whatever people want, because the actual voice that could correct us is locked behind Linear A. Now, are there any real hopes for cracking it? Yes, but they're not glamorous. The most practical hope is more data, more inscriptions, longer texts, better context, and possibly someday a bilingual. Another hope is improved computational analysis, pattern recognition, statistical modeling, comparing sign sequences across contexts. That can help narrow functions and structure, but it still runs into the language problem. Without knowing what language is underneath, you're solving a cipher without knowing the target language, which is hard. Not impossible in principle, but hard. So for now, Linear A remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. Now here's the important transition. Even if we can't read it, the existence of Linear A tells us something undeniable. The Minoans were not just artists and sailors, they were administrators. They ran complex institutions that needed records. They measured and counted, they managed surplus, they coordinated labor and goods. That is civilization-level complexity. It's bureaucracy in the neutral sense. And bureaucracy is boring until it's not, because bureaucracies create power, they create stability, and they create vulnerability too, because when a bureaucratic system collapses, the whole structure can break fast. So Linear A is not only a mystery, it's a sign that the Minoan world had a deep internal organization. And then we hit the looming question. What happens to a highly connected, administratively complex society when it gets hit by a shock? Not a small shock, a system-level shock. That's where we're going next, because in the mid-2nd millennium BCE, the Aegean doesn't just experience change, it experiences something closer to catastrophe. Fire, ash, sea, and a volcanic eruption that still feels like an apocalypse when you read about it. The Thera eruption, Santorini, and what it might have done to the world the Minoans built. Imagine an island volcano that's been building pressure for centuries. Not a cute little eruption with lava you can take selfies with. I mean the kind that rewrites coastlines, the kind that people centuries later might still be telling stories about without even realizing what they're remembering. That's Thera. Today we call it Santorini. Back then, it was a living volcano sitting in the same maritime world the Minoans depended on. And at some point in the 2nd millennium BCE, it erupted in a way that was, by any human standard, insane. This is one of those moments where apocalypse isn't just clickbait language. Even if we don't know every detail, the scale was enormous. Now, let's get one important thing out of the way before we go full disaster movie. The eruption didn't necessarily instantly wipe out the Minoans. That simple version is popular because it's tidy. One big event, one big collapse. History rarely behaves that neatly. What Thera gives us is something more realistic and honestly scarier. A shock. Possibly multiple shocks, a massive disruption hitting a society that was strong, but strong in a networked way. Meaning, if you break the connections, you don't have to conquer every palace room by room. The system can weaken on its own. So what actually happens in an eruption like this, in practical terms? You can break it into a few kinds of damage. First, the explosion itself. When a volcano erupts at that scale, you're not just throwing lava, you're throwing ash high into the atmosphere. You're collapsing the structure of the island. You're pushing out shock waves. You're turning the sea into a weapon. And that brings us to the thing everyone remembers, the tsunami. If Thera's eruption involved major collapse into the sea, and many researchers think it did, then you're looking at large waves radiating outward. And Crete is not that far away. Coastal settlements, ports, harbors, fleets pulled up on shore, warehouses near the waterline, those places are exactly what a tsunami targets. Even one huge wave can ruin a port. Multiple waves can erase an entire coastal zone. And if your power is maritime, your ports are not optional. They're your lifeline. So that's one possible impact. Not the whole island of Crete sinks, no, but the coastal infrastructure, the stuff that keeps trade moving, could get hammered. Second, ash. Ash sounds almost soft, like dust. In reality, heavy ashfall can collapse roofs, contaminate water sources, and ruin farmland. Even a thinner layer can mess with agriculture. It can damage crops, it can stress animals, it can disrupt planting cycles. And again, for a palace-centered economy that depends on surplus, bad harvests are not just inconvenient, they're destabilizing. They reduce what you can store. They reduce what you can redistribute. They increase competition. They make people nervous. Third, climate effects. Big eruptions can inject particles into the atmosphere that affect sunlight and temperature patterns, at least for a time. I want to phrase this carefully because it's easy to overstate. We are not claiming a permanent ice age, but even a shorter period of cooler temperatures or disrupted rainfall can be enough to push a vulnerable system toward crisis, especially if the system is already stretched. And that's the key word, stretched. Because by the late Minoan period, you're looking at complex palaces, high levels of specialization, lots of movement of goods, lots of dependence on stability. That's a high-performance system. High-performance systems can be amazing. They can also be brittle. Now, the next issue is the one you'll see debated a lot. When exactly did the eruption happen? And I'm not going to pretend there's one neat date everybody agrees on, because there isn't. Different dating methods and different interpretations have produced different timelines. What matters for our story is not the exact year down to the last digit. What matters is that it falls in the general window when the Minoan world was still very active and when signs of disruption start to appear in the region. The dating debate matters because if the eruption is earlier, you have more time between the eruption and the final collapse of the palace system. If the eruption is later, it lines up more tightly. Either way, the eruption is real, the scale is real, the shock is real. The question is how directly we can draw a straight line from volcano to collapse. I'm going to give you the version that holds up best in a careful lecture. Thera didn't have to be the single killing blow to matter enormously. It could have been the event that knocks the system off balance. It could have forced rebuilding. It could have weakened coastal nodes. It could have reduced the fleet. It could have triggered economic stress. It could have shaken confidence in the religious order if people interpreted disaster as divine anger. And if the Minoan world then faced additional pressures afterward, the recovery window might have been where the real story played out. Because civilizations often don't die in the moment of impact, they die in the recovery. They die in the arguments about resources. They die when rivals take advantage of the weakness. Now, let's talk about what weakness might look like archaeologically, because I don't want this to be all vibes. One thing you see in parts of the Minoan record is destruction layers and rebuilding phases. Crete is also in an earthquake zone, so destruction layers can come from multiple causes, but the pattern of damage and repair matters. Another thing you see is a shift in who seems to be in control later on, especially when Mycenaean elements start appearing more strongly. And we'll get there next chapter. But for now, just hold the logic. A massive eruption disrupts ports and ships. Even partial disruption reduces trade. Reduced trade reduces palace surplus. Reduced surplus increases internal tension. Internal tension weakens centralized institutions, and once centralized institutions weaken, external takeover becomes easier. That's a plausible chain, not guaranteed, but plausible. Now, I want to be honest about something that people sometimes miss. There's a temptation to treat a volcanic eruption like a magic explanation because it feels objective. Nature did it, mystery solved. But human societies are not dominoes. They're messy. After a disaster, people make choices. Leaders respond well or badly. Communities cooperate or fracture. Rival powers act opportunistically. So, even if Thera is a giant event in the background, the foreground still matters. Politics matters. Economics matters. Social cohesion matters. The ability to reorganize matters. And the Minoans were not helpless. They rebuilt after earthquakes before. They had networks. They had skills. So the real question becomes, did Thera push them past a threshold? Did it create a new normal where the old system couldn't fully reassert itself? Did it open the door for mainland powers to step in? Because there's a difference between damaged and replaced. Thera can help explain damage. Replacement usually involves humans. Which brings me to one more piece that people love to talk about, and I get why: the psychological impact. Imagine you're a coastal community on Crete. You wake up to the sea behaving like something alive and angry. You see waves that don't make sense. You see boats hurled inland. You see buildings torn open. Later, you hear stories from sailors about an island exploding, ash falling, skies darkening. Even if you survive, that changes you. And in a society where ritual and power are intertwined, as we said in the last chapter, disaster isn't just physical, it's spiritual, it's political, it's a legitimacy crisis. People start asking, quietly at first, then louder, are the gods still with us? Are the leaders still protected? Are the old ways still working? And that kind of doubt can spread faster than ash. So, chapter takeaway. The Thera eruption is real, and it was huge. It likely caused major disruption across the Aegean, potentially including tsunamis and ash impacts that could damage coastal infrastructure and agriculture. But it probably wasn't a single on-off switch that erased the Minoans overnight. It's better understood as the beginning of the end, or maybe the moment the end becomes possible. A systemic shock hitting a system built on connection. And now, after the shock, we have to ask the hard question. If the Minoans were weakened, who moved in? Who inherited the palaces? Who took over the routes? Who wrote the next chapter of the Aegean world? That's where the Mycenaeans enter, and that's where the Minoans stop being the authors of their own story and become, in a painful way, part of someone else's. So here's the uncomfortable part of the story. Civilizations don't usually get a clean ending. They get a messy handover. They get years, sometimes generations, where the old institutions still exist, but they're running on stress and improvisation. And then, almost before anyone has time to write the epitaph, somebody else is in the room holding the keys. That's roughly what we're dealing with as we move into the later phase of Minoan Crete. The world of the palaces doesn't just blink off, but it changes. And the change has a name we can actually anchor because it's tied to a culture we know more about, the Mycenaeans. Mainland Greek-speaking elites centered around places like Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes. These are the people who show up later in Greek tradition as the heroes of the so-called heroic age. Agamemnon, Menelaus, the Trojan War vibe, that world. But before all the poetry, they were Bronze Age power players, and at some point, Crete ends up in their orbit. Now, what does takeover mean here? We should not imagine one dramatic invasion scene where Mycenaean warriors storm Knossos and the Minoans vanish in a single afternoon. That makes good television. It's rarely how archaeology reads. What we do see is a shift in material culture and administration that strongly suggests Mycenaean control, at least over major centers. And the clearest evidence, the one that really changes the conversation, is writing. Because after a certain point, the tablets we find are not in linear A anymore. They're in linear B. And linear B, as we said, writes Greek. That is a massive clue. If Greek is being used for administration on Crete, that means Greek-speaking administrators are running things, or at least the system is being run in a Greek administrative language. Either way, it signals a change in who holds institutional power. And this is one of those moments where the story becomes less ghostly. We don't suddenly get a full narrative, but the evidence gets more legible. And what it says is basically, the palace system continues, but under new management. Now, why would the Mycenaeans be able to take over? This is where the previous chapter matters. If Crete has been hit by systemic shock, Thera, earthquakes, economic disruption, whatever combination, then the island is still wealthy, still strategically located, still full of infrastructure worth controlling, but it may be more vulnerable. A maritime, networked society can be powerful, but if its routes break and its central institutions lose stability, it becomes a prize. And the Mycenaeans, unlike the Minoans and their own imagery, do lean more visibly into a militarized style. Their mainland centers tend to be heavily fortified. Their elite culture includes weapons as status symbols. Their tombs show a different kind of political vibe. So if you're asking who would take advantage of a weakened Crete, the Mycenaeans are a very plausible answer. But again, takeover doesn't have to mean only violence. It can also mean elite replacement through politics, marriage alliances, installation of governors, control of key nodes, a gradual shift where local elites become dependent on mainland power, some combination of pressure and opportunity. So the safest way to phrase it is, by the later Bronze Age, Crete shows strong evidence of Mycenaean presence and administrative control, and the old Minoan system is transformed. Now, what happens to the Minoans themselves in this process? This is the part that's hard, because it doesn't make for a clean identity story. They don't just disappear biologically. People don't evaporate. Cultures shift. Languages get replaced or pushed into smaller spaces. Elites get displaced. Institutions change hands. Art styles blend. Religious practices adapt. So rather than the Minoans are gone, it's more accurate to say the distinctive Minoan palace-centered civilization as an independent power with its own administrative language loses control of its major institutions. The people remain, but the system changes. And that kind of ending is actually very common in history. It's just less dramatic than extinction. Now, here's something I want to underline, because it's important for the legacy question. Even under Mycenaean control, Crete doesn't become irrelevant. It remains a valuable place. It remains connected. It remains culturally influential. And you can even argue that parts of the Minoan world get absorbed into what later Greeks become. In other words, Minoan Crete is not only a lost civilization, it's also an ingredient. It feeds forward. You can see echoes in art, in religious symbolism, in myth, in the way later Greeks talk about Crete as ancient and authoritative. So the legacy isn't just ruins, the legacy is memory. And memory is where we have to talk about Atlantis. Because this is the point where people's brains go, wait, an advanced island civilization, powerful at sea, destroyed by catastrophe, remembered later as a cautionary tale. Are we talking about Atlantis? And the honest answer is, we can't prove a direct connection. But it's also not crazy that people keep asking. So let's treat Atlantis carefully. Plato tells the Atlantis story in dialogues written in the 4th century BCE, long after the Bronze Age, and he uses it as philosophy. It's a story about hubris, moral decline, and the ideal state set against a powerful enemy that gets destroyed in a dramatic cataclysm. So, as a baseline, we should assume Plato is doing a literary and philosophical project, not writing history the way we'd expect a historian to write. That said, philosophers don't invent in a vacuum. They borrow, they remix, they use older motifs that their audiences find plausible. And the Mediterranean had real memories of disaster. It had real ruins that looked ancient even to ancient people. It had real stories about lost cities and drowned lands, because earthquakes and tsunamis are not rare in that region. So when Plato describes an island power destroyed by earthquakes and floods, he may be tapping into a cultural reservoir of catastrophe narratives. And one of the largest, most famous, most plausibly rememberable catastrophes in the Aegean is the Thera eruption and its aftermath. Now, does that mean Atlantis equals Minoan Crete? No. Plato's Atlantis is usually placed beyond the Pillars of Heracles, and the geography in his story doesn't match Crete in a literal way. The scale in his story is also exaggerated, and again, he's writing philosophy. But here's the more reasonable version that I think works well in a lecture without turning into conspiracy. It's possible that real events like the Thera eruption and the collapse of Bronze Age island networks contributed, indirectly, to later Greek imagination about sudden civilizational destruction, not as a one-to-one map, more as emotional memory, a template, a story shape, an advanced world, a catastrophic end, a lesson. And Crete, because it was famous, and because it was already saturated with myths about kings and labyrinths and monsters, becomes an easy place for that kind of story shape to stick. So Atlantis, in this framing, is less a mystery solved and more a window into how people process trauma across time. The physical ruins remain, the details blur, the moral lesson grows, and eventually you get a story like Atlantis that feels ancient, even if it's written much later. Now, let's land the plane with the Minoans themselves, because we don't want to end on Atlantis like it's the whole point. The point is that the Minoans were real. They built one of the most sophisticated societies in Bronze Age Europe. They created architecture that still confuses and impresses. They ran complex economies and wrote records we still can't read. They connected the Mediterranean through sea routes and cultural influence. And then their system weakened under a combination of shocks: natural disasters, seismic instability, economic disruption, and human competition. The Mycenaeans step in. The administrative language shifts to Greek, the palaces change hands, and the distinctive Minoan civilization, as an independent power, fades into a new world order. But here's the twist, and it's why I think this story matters. The Minoans don't just vanish. They remain as a ghost in the foundations of later Greek culture, in myths that turn palaces into labyrinths, in symbols that survive in stories about bulls and kings, in the simple fact that when the classical Greeks looked backward, Crete felt ancient even to them. And that's a powerful reminder, honestly. Civilizations aren't just stacks of dates. They're layers of influence, layers of memory, layers of borrowed images and half-remembered catastrophes. So if you're looking for a final takeaway, it's this. The Minoans show us that Europe didn't begin with marble temples and philosophers in white robes. It began earlier, messier, saltier, painted in bright colors, dependent on ships and trade winds, full of ritual and bureaucracy, and haunted by the kind of catastrophe that can turn a golden age into a story. And maybe that's why we keep coming back, because it's not only about what they built, it's about how fragile even the most beautiful systems can be, and how thousands of years later we're still trying to read the tablets, still staring at the ruins, still asking the same human question: what happened? And could it happen again? Thank you so much for watching our video and supporting the channel. See you in the next episodes, and good night.